I am happy now to introduce one of a young man that I am so impressed with, and I'm sure you will be, and with whom we have worked over the years and will continue to work. And his work with his organization has helped inform ours. And we can give you you should go on their website and check them out, but we can also provide a link. So it is my honor to introduce to you James Dold. And James is the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids. And Human Rights for Kids is a DC-based nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and protecting the human rights of children in the United States and around the world. Under James' leadership, the organization has authored and co-authored amicus briefs in state and federal courts, including the US Supreme Court, on human rights issues impacting children. His advocacy has led to the introduction of more than 24 children's rights bills in Congress and states across the United States. Prior to launching Human Rights for Kids, James developed and implemented the advocacy strategy that led to the, listen to this, quadrupling of states that ban life without parole sentences for children in the United States. That's huge. That's impressive. James also led successful state legislative campaigns, resulting in the passage of 40 new anti-human trafficking laws across this country. And he is licensed to practice in the state of Maryland and is a member of the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. James is also a human rights abuse survivor himself. James, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you so much, Herschela, for that wonderful introduction, and to Betsy and Louise for inviting me to be the keynote. I'm incredibly honored. I wouldn't be much of a keynote if I did not make sure that I directed people to the chat box where you can donate to the Juvenile Justice Initiative. It's an incredible organization, as the video demonstrated, you know, the incredible work that has transpired over the last 2 decades that has really fundamentally reshaped how children encounter the criminal legal system in Illinois is in large thanks due to the incredible work of this organization. I know you all are familiar with Betsy and the incredible work that has been going on there for the last 2 decades, but really, I can speak from personal experience as an executive director, the difficulty with fundraising and how much we depend on the support of donors like you all. You know, it can't be overstated enough. So please make sure that you donate before you leave here today. And please also donate to the silent auction. I think that's going to be going on through the pendency of today's proceedings. So please make sure that you do that. Again, I'm James Dold. I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. And I have a brief PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing with folks as we get underway, and I discuss some of the importance of the Juvenile Justice Initiative's work and how that fits into the broader landscape of what we're trying to do in terms of our efforts to change the way that children are treated in the criminal justice system. So, you know, to get started, and, you know, we really need to stop and I think credit, you know, Betsy and folks like Bernadine Dorn, who, you know, really tried to push and established this human rights framework back really when nobody else was talking about human rights. They weren't really, you know, people I think were afraid to talk about these basic human rights protections because somehow it was sort of a boogeyman that folks, you know, didn't want to have out there. But really, it's the cornerstone of of the criminal legal system. Whether you're talking about protecting people from human rights abuses happening against the government, or protecting the government from creating harms against people, right? And the Convention on the Rights of the Child, when it was adopted more than 30 years ago, was meant to be that standard by which we held children to a different account than we do adults. And even before that, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they also had protections that were spelled out specifically for children. And I have a couple of here on the screen that I've highlighted because I think they represent some of the most egregious forms of human rights violations that the United States is currently engaged in. And that includes Articles 37, 39, and 40 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Of course, these prohibit the use of the death penalty, life without parole sentences for children, as well as the use of cruel and degrading punishments such as solitary confinement. Article 40 also specifically spells out the need to treat children differently in the system and have increased protections for them, including the establishment of a minimum age by which children are deemed capable of transgressing the criminal law. And then, of course, Articles 39, which it's sandwiched between Articles 37 and Article 40, and it really deals with kids who've been victims of abuse and neglect and harm. And I included that here because what we all know from our experience working with kids in the justice system is that the vast majority of these children are victims of abuse and neglect and severe forms of adverse childhood experiences. And oftentimes that trauma goes unaccounted for in the criminal legal system and how it responds specifically to these youth. And we have an obligation, even though we haven't ratified the CRC, we have an obligation to these child victims of abuse and harm to do everything that we can to make sure that they get the treatment and services that they need and that they are successfully reintegrated back into society, even when they transgress the criminal law. And that's one of the really important components, I think, of the CRC that often goes not mentioned enough, is the importance of focusing on trauma for kids in the justice system. And then, of course, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Articles 10 and Articles 14, also mirror many of these same protections that are outlined in the CRC, which we are a treaty party to as a nation. And this brings me to a significant point that was raised a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, in fact, by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. There was a report that was released specifically on the United States' treatment of kids in the U.S. justice system. And the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations specifically found that the U.S. was in violation of its treaty obligations under the ICCPR because we did not limit our treatment of kids as adults to exceptional, quote unquote, exceptional circumstances, but rather that reservation that we had made to that specific treaty had been converted into this expansive gap that had resulted in the violation of children's human rights at the local, state, and federal levels. And this finding in this report really got us interested at Human Rights for Kids and diving a little bit more deeply into both the recommendations that the Inter-American Commission developed within the report, as well as what were the basic underpinnings of the legal system that allowed such human rights violations to happen, or rather the lack of legal protections that were in place that allowed the proliferation of these human rights violations. And so in 2020, last year, we released the first ever national state ratings report where we rated all 50 states and DC on how well or how poorly they treated children in the justice system based on 12 categories of law that we deemed essential to protecting the human rights of children in the justice system. And again, that were all informed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the ICCPR, and the recommendations that were directly found in the Inter-American Commission's report. A couple of things to highlight about this report was that, we knew that we couldn't capture all of the different human rights protections that were outlined in these human rights documents, but we wanted to try to focus on the most important, the ones that had really resulted in the most severe violation of children's rights in the United States, give the country sort of a baseline of where we're at today, and really inspire policymakers and the public to demand change through legislative action so that we weren't a global outlier in how we treated children who come into conflict with the law. So based on our research, the 12 categories that we identified, we kind of put into these four different buckets. So the first bucket is, what happens when kids first come into contact with the legal system at the point of arrest. Then the next bucket is really jurisdictional, dealing with which courts have jurisdiction over which children, either in juvenile or in the adult criminal justice system. What happens, the next bucket is what happens when kids are tried in the adult system, even though that's a violation of human rights standards. We knew that that was going to be sort of tough sledding for us to completely remove kids from the adult system. And so we wanted to at least bring the statutes more in line with those basic human rights protections. And then the last category, really dealing with what happens when children transition back into society, right? So the first category there is designed to make sure that children, before they can waive their Miranda or be subject to a custodial interrogation, that they have to consult with legal counsel or their parents, and that their parents have to be notified before any such waiver can be given. The next category there is establishing a minimum age of criminal culpability of at least 10. In our model law, of course, we're urging states to go further to replicate what states like Massachusetts have done, where they've established at least a minimum age of 12. Of course, that's not even good enough as well, because we know that the UN Committee on Children's Rights has also stated that that minimum age really should be at least 14. But again, sort of establishing a baseline for the first time in the history of the country of what we really need to be doing, making sure that juvenile court jurisdiction is extended to all children under the age of 18, establishing a minimum age of at least 14 for children to even be eligible to be tried in the adult criminal justice system to begin with. Again, in our model law, we were pushing states to go much further than that, but establishing as a baseline a minimum of at least 14. And then getting rid of all mandatory minimum sentences as they apply to children, right? Allowing judges to deviate from any mandatory minimum sentences, banning the felony murder rule for children, eliminating life and de facto life without parole sentences, making sure that children have the ability to have their sentences reviewed after no more than 15 years of incarceration, ending the practice of placing children in solitary confinement, prohibiting children from being placed in adult jails and prisons, ending mandatory or lengthy post-release supervision, such as lifetime parole, for example, and then, of course, voting rights restoration. And these last two really being critical to making sure that children can be fully integrated citizens of society once they've been released. And so these 12 categories we used to develop a scoring mechanism to place states into one of four categories. Tier 1 being the best, Tier 4 being the worst. And as you can kind of see here, based on the color-coded nature of the tiers that we developed, the vast majority of the country, 42 states, actually fell into our Tier 3 and Tier 4 categories, which means that they had made minimal to no efforts to protect the human rights of kids in the justice system. We had one state barely make the Tier 1, which was California. They got a 9 and 9.5, so we rounded up for them. But for the vast majority of the country, we are really looking at a situation where we're dealing with what I describe as the largest government-sanctioned human rights abuse against children in the world today. You can take a globe, spin it, and you'll see that every country except the United States has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that no other country treats children as poorly as we do as far as violating their human rights on such a systemic level. From a visual standpoint, you can see here just how bad it looks. I know a lot of the COVID maps look a little bit like this right now. And so, it's basically how, it looks for kids in our justice system, just as bad as we're doing with the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple of important points to highlight here are, if you look on the far right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the best human rights protectors and then the worst human rights offenders. And I always like to call attention to the fact that, the states that actually scored the highest in our state ratings report might surprise people, because you have California, North Dakota, and Arkansas all lumped together as having the highest scores, and North Dakota and Arkansas obviously being, two of the more conservative states in the union, California being one of the more liberal ones. And then with the worst human rights offenders, you have states like Alabama and in Georgia, which probably don't come as a surprise to many people. But right there, you also have lumped in with them Maryland, right, which has been known as a traditionally blue or more liberal leaning state. And what this really should say to people is that, you know, these issues are and can be nonpartisan and bipartisan. And we do see Republican and Democratic leadership alike. And we also see Democratic and Republican failure alike across the country, right? And so it's really important for us as a broader movement to make sure that these policies are embraced across the board. This slide here is just kind of what I was talking about in terms of the basic findings of our report. And to go into a little bit more detail here, you know, I'll go through each of the categories just real briefly. You know, Illinois, of course, they're getting partial credit in part on this very first slide of having due process protections in place for kids because of the Juvenile Justice Initiative's work to ensure that children under the age of 15 have access to legal counsel. Illinois got partial credit for this category because of JJI's work. And as you can see from the map, not many states have these protections in place at all. Right, there are very few states that got full credit, and just a handful that got partial credit, and most of the country is lacking. But having this basic due process protection in place is absolutely critical to protecting the human rights of kids at the very beginning stages of the justice system. The minimum age of criminal culpability, making sure that we have a minimum age of at least 10. It's actually oftentimes a shocking map, and there are states here that have higher minimum ages, but they don't receive credit in our state ratings report because they allow exceptions for kids who are convicted of homicide, for example, or accused of homicide. So, for example, in both Utah and California, they have an upper age of 12, but they allow children under that age to be prosecuted for homicide, and there's no minimum age by which they would go. So, you know, essentially, you could have a 7 or an 8-year-old you know, serving a potential sentence because of a homicide-related offense. And so the states that have no exceptions, I always draw people's attention to include states like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. I always tell people, Mississippi can do it, you can do it. So, you know, this is not something that should be partisan by any means, and you know, something that, you know, Democrats and Republicans alike should be able to embrace. Thankfully, we've made a lot of progress on you know, extending juvenile court jurisdiction to just about every state, with the exception of Texas, Wisconsin, and Georgia. Michigan was in this category up until recently, when their law recently went into effect at the beginning of this year. Again, looking at adult court jurisdiction, the vast majority of the country did not receive full credit. There was only one state that received credit for establishing a minimum age of at least 14 for all kids to be eligible to be tried as an adult, as well as prohibiting the automatic transfer of children under any circumstances. So requiring a juvenile court hearing before any child can be waived up to adult court. And that was Kansas. I was shocked by this. You know, you do these reports sometimes and you learn quite a bit about the state of the country. But all the other states that you see that receives partial credit were states that establish a minimum age of at least 14 for a child to be eligible to be tried in the adult criminal justice system. Mandatory minimum sentences, this was one of the worst categories for us as a country. The vast majority of the nation, you know, when children are tried as an adult, they face the same mandatory minimums, with the exception of Washington, Montana, and Virginia. This map is a little bit out of date because this was from last year. Maryland actually just passed legislation this year allowing judges to deviate from mandatory minimum sentences. But this is, again, is another really important protection when we're talking about these basic human rights principles for children. Eliminating the felony murder rule is another one. There was a case recently there in Illinois. Thankfully, prosecutors didn't charge the boys there with felony murder, but highlighted the absurdity of the rule overall. But again, this is another area that we really need to move further in as a country. And then banning life without parole sentences for children. I will state too that the one limitation of our report is that we don't take into account Supreme Court cases from states. So folks might be looking at, for example, state like Iowa or Washington State that also don't have life without parole sentences, but don't receive credit in our report because the legislature hasn't codified those decisions. And so our report really is just limited to just the laws that are on the books. And then the release safety valve. Of course, we know that life without parole is just one step in that process. You have to get rid of de facto life without parole, and far less number of states have actually done that. And so that's another thing that we need to continue to push from a basic human rights standpoint. Eliminating solitary confinement is another. And then banning the incarceration of children in adult jails and prisons. Every state, with the exception of California, West Virginia, and Rhode Island, allow children to be held in adult jails or adult prisons, of course, subject to sight and sound restrictions via PREA. Unfortunately, this is perhaps one of the worst human rights violations when we're talking about our treatment of kids in the justice system, and the danger that we place them in when we allow them to be placed in facilities with older adults. This category I was kind of shocked by, ending lifetime supervision or lengthy post-release supervision. I did not realize so many states had mechanisms that allowed so many people to be released from parole or court supervision after they'd been released from incarceration, but I was pleasantly surprised. And of course, this was also connected to our final category, which was voting rights restoration. So many states sort of hinder whether or not you can have your voting rights restored based on whether or not you've completed your total sentence, which includes oftentimes a period of probation or parole. And so these last two categories really sort of are part and parcel of one another when we're looking at making sure that people have the ability to become fully fledged citizens and successfully reintegrated back into society again. And I wanted to just spend a little bit of time, I think the overarching theme from hopefully what people just looked at and what I've mentioned here is that, how we treat children is really an abomination. We are a global outlier. There really is no excuse for the sorry state of human rights protections for kids in our legal system today. And there's a big question of, why? What has happened to allow the United States to treat children in such a horrific way? We have these, cases that aren't really outliers where, we see child sex trafficking victims, for example, who get, life imprisonment, life without parole, for crimes committed against the rapists and traffickers. And, people, for example, like Sarah Cruzan, who's out in California, who had a life without parole sentence out there for a crime she committed at 16 against her trafficker, or Alexis Martin, or Centoya Brown in Tennessee. They're trying to prosecute a young girl by the name of Crystal Kaiser right now in Wisconsin. All of these girls were victims of rape and trafficking. And I mention their names because they've been high profiled in the media too. So I just want to mention that as well. They're sort of, their stories are known and out there. And many of them have also shared their stories publicly through congressional listening sessions. And so, but nevertheless, the question remains, how and why have we gotten so comfortable treating children in such a horrific way? What psychological context could explain this? And there have been a number of studies that have been done that talk about what happens when we dehumanize a group of minority people in the United States. And, one study from 2014 called The Essence of Innocence talked about this idea that children, are often afforded fewer protections where they are dehumanized, making them vulnerable to harsh treatment, usually reserved for adults. And when we engage in this process of dehumanization, what that means is we eliminate this idea that the people we're talking about, the group of humans that we're talking about, are actually children. They're no longer innocent in our eyes, and therefore it makes it morally acceptable for us to treat them as if they were adults, that they were miniature adults, if you will. And if you step back even further, when we think about, well, why would we go through all this trouble to specifically dehumanize children? And let's be clear too about the children that we're talking about. Every year, there's roughly 76,000 children who are prosecuted as adults in the criminal legal system in the United States. Roughly 83% of all of those children are racial minorities, with the vast majority of those children being African American. And so, and when we look at children who are in adult jails and prisons, 60% of those children are Black. And so when we're talking about our population, we are talking about children who are Black or have Hispanic ethnicity, right? And when we think about the whole process of dehumanization as being a necessary precondition for culturally and or state-sanctioned violence, the answer becomes a little bit more clear, right? By dehumanizing people, it makes it morally and socially acceptable to do unspeakable things to them. So for example, if we begin to associate child with, a monster instead through images in the media and negative portrayal of Black and brown youth, we no longer see Black children or brown children as children. We can see them, and we can be conditioned to see them as monsters, or as one academic called them, super predators, right? So it's vitally important to understand that how we got to where we're at today as a nation really started back in 1995, and even predates that, because we can go much further back and trace the history from the horrible treatment of people of color in our country to today. But really looking at the super predator theory and the resulting policies that came about because policymakers were urged to pass laws that made it easier to try and prosecute children in the adult system, because if they didn't, there was going to be an onslaught of bloodshed that would be, that lawmakers would no longer be able to contain. And these children at that time were described as being godless, jobless, and fatherless monsters. And the proponents of this theory stated specifically that the problem was going to be greatest in quote unquote Black inner city neighborhoods, right? So there was this very targeted attempt by the proponents of this theory, as well as the media in the late 1980s and early 1990s, to portray Black and brown youth as these horrible monsters. And that's how we became comfortable as a society engaging in these wide-scale human rights violations against our children. And so as we think about how we move forward out of this space, what the work needs to look like going forward, it's important to place this into its proper context, particularly as it relates to racial justice and the intersection of racial justice with criminal justice reform work. Illinois, in particular, is not doing as well as one might expect a more blue or a more democratic leaning state to do in our state ratings report. We awarded Illinois only 3.5 points out of a possible 12, putting it well behind conservative states like West Virginia or Arkansas, for example. But it did receive credit, like I mentioned, for having these due process protections in place, at least partial credit there, extending juvenile court jurisdiction to all children under 18, eliminating mandatory lifetime or lengthy post-release supervision, and voting rights restoration for formerly incarcerated youth. And it's important to highlight that the Juvenile Justice Initiative has led the effort on many, if not all, of these issues that we're talking about. So when we're talking about these basic human rights protections, it's been JJI at the forefront of these human rights battles. They were the organization that led the effort to raise the age of juvenile court to 18, to end the automatic adult prosecution for 15-year-olds, required lawyers during interrogation for children under the age of 15, ended detention of children under the age of 13 in Cook County, reduced incarceration by 2/3, and closed 3 juvenile prisons. And when we look back over the last 2 decades in particular, it's really it's an incredible track record of success that this organization has had in transforming the legal landscape in Illinois to make sure that these basic human rights protections were in place for children, and that the city of Chicago itself really began to embrace this human rights model, right? So just this year, JJI was instrumental in passing a bill to create legal privilege of communication and restorative justice practices. In 2019, the 30-year anniversary of the CRC, JJI was able to get the Chicago Human Rights for Children resolution adopted, which called for government agencies affiliated with juvenile justice to review and compare policies to recommendations by the CRC and the global study on children deprived of liberty. I mean, this can't go understated of how important this is to get a city the size of Chicago that impacts so many Black and brown youth to actually take a look and review their policies and compare them to these international human rights standards, particularly those that are found in the CRC. 2018, JJI made sure that there was funding for the statewide Juvenile Defender Resource Center, 2016. And I'm not going through all of the bills. I've actually just cherry picked a couple I wanted to highlight here, just to give folks a flavor of all of the incredible work the organization has done over the past 2 decades. There are many, many other bills and policy changes that the initiative has been able to bring about, which is really just incredible. But in 2016, making sure that there is a requirement for a lawyer throughout the interrogation process for children under the age of 15. This is the provision that I mentioned that got the state partial credit in our state ratings report review. 2015, transfer reform, so requiring judicial review of transfers for 15-year-olds for all offenses and all charged with armed robbery with a firearm. Raising the age in 2013 to make sure that 17-year-olds charged with felonies in juvenile court. In 2011, the least restrictive alternative for sentencing, making sure that alternatives as standard for sentencing youth to confinement requires courts to consider all reasonable efforts have been made to keep youth at home rather than being incarcerated. And then, of course, in 2010, being instrumental in the passage of a resolution where the Illinois legislature urged the Senate to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As I mentioned before, the United States is the only country that has not ratified the CRC. And that's just in the last 10 years alone. And that's just having cherry picked a number of items that JJI has been instrumental in passing. There are so many other reforms, if you go back even further, that this incredible organization has been able to spearhead and shepherd through. And so, as I wrap up, I just want to highlight the fact that, in order to really get to the place of where we're trying to go as a state, as a nation, we all need to be working together, using this human rights frame, making sure that we are holding policymakers accountable for how children are treated in the justice system. And no organization has done that as effectively as the Juvenile Justice Initiative. I just can't say enough about this incredible organization, the work that they have done, and I hope that people will donate today and continue to support the incredible work that they've done. Thank you so much for having me, for allowing me to speak here, Betsy. I know I've gone over time, way over time probably. I warned you guys that I'm a little bit overly verbose when I give these sorts of talks, but I just want to thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Hershela, and thank you all so much for this opportunity.
We are going to just keep this moving. Thank you so much. Deeply appreciated.